Good morning, everyone. Hi, I'm Sally Benson. I'm a professor of energy resources engineering at Stanford University. And today I'm going to be talking about global warming, the growing climate crisis, and what we can do about it, and in particular, focusing on Silicon Valley. So I want to go back about a decade ago. And lots of people were concerned about climate change. It was viewed as something that would have very serious consequences to society in the future, but maybe it was decades out. And another thing that was very important is that people felt, well, it was going to be important for the world, but it wasn't necessarily going to be important for them. It wasn't going to change their life, which resulted in them caring about it, but not necessarily being terribly motivated to do anything about it. And in the last 10 years, literally everything has changed. And I think the bottom line is that we all understand that the consequences of climate change are simply becoming unbearable. And everyone has their own climate story. You know, the impacts of climate vary depending on where you are. But I don't think anyone has been immune. And this is a picture of an event that just happened just a week ago in Texas in particular, was sort of the epicenter of this. But what you can see, that big, huge blue thing in the middle of the United States is literally a swath of cold air, Arctic air that came rushing down into the country because climate change has made it so that the jet stream is weaker and can't hold the cold up there. So in Texas, what happened over a period of 6 days or so, uh, frigid temperatures occurred throughout the state, temperatures of 6 degrees. Now, that's not a big deal if you live in Colorado, but if you live in a place with a warm climate, if you live in a place with electric heating, with poor insulation, it's going to be very, very difficult to cope with. And the consequences have really been devastating. Over 70 people have died. They're estimated $18 billion in damages. People are without water. People without sewage. I just got off the phone with my student whose family has been without any running water or sewage for about a week now. So people are beginning to feel this is very immediate. And the other challenge associated with the impacts of climate change is that, you know, the world was built to accommodate the sort of historical weather patterns that we have. And if you've never had 6 cold days like this in a row, you will not build your pipelines, you will not build your wind turbines to be resilient against those kind of things. So the consequences is that basically the power system in Texas came minutes away from complete failure that would have left the whole state without power. Instead, luckily, they were able to sort of hold things together, and only about 4 million people were lacking power. But so many things sort of fell apart: the wind turbines, the gas fields, and so forth, leading to this catastrophic failure. So we need to think about, you know, how do we build an infrastructure that's resilient to these kind of phenomena. So that's a Texas story, real, just a week ago. Very devastating impacts. But what about California? You know, we have our own story. I've lived in California my whole lifetime, and wildfires were, you know, a fairly regular occurrence, but they happen maybe once or twice a year. They happened largely in October. But now what we see is that fires begin in June often, and then they actually last through November. So these devastating wildfires are becoming the new normal. And, you know, estimates of damages associated with this, like the 2018 fires, about $150 billion just one year. You know, that's to say nothing of last year. And if we think about last summer and those orange skies and the months and months of terrible quality air, you know, I think it's fair to say this is unbearable. And we're not the only place. Australia is also really suffering from these kind of consequences. So I think there's been a fundamental shift in the way people think about this, that climate change has become personal, it's become local, it's become painful and really expensive. So whereas for climate scientists who've been really forecasting this and understanding and predicting the nature of the kind of events we see, it's been difficult to motivate the kind of action that we need if we're going to solve this problem. Whoops. So how much warming have we actually had? If you look back to about 1880, the temperature always varies, but this is a graph looking at the change in temperature. And in total, we've had about 1.2 degrees C of warming. Now, and that's about, oh gosh, like 3.5 degrees Fahrenheit or something. And so, or not quite that big, about 3 degrees Fahrenheit. So that doesn't really sound. But what we see is even these small temperature changes, these global average temperature changes, actually lead to devastating local consequences. So if we look to the future, if we continue to do what we're doing, if we continue to emit, even exactly at the level we are, imagine it stops growing, we're able to stabilize emissions, we're going to hit the 2 degrees C threshold 20 to 30 years from now. And 2 degrees C is the international target that governments came together to support. But I think that now we're living in this 1.2 degrees C warming world. I can't imagine what a 2 degrees C warming world would look like and how painful and costly that's going to be. So it needs to further motivate us to try to push towards lower targets, for example, limiting warming to 1.5 degrees C. So if all of this happens, not to be doomsdayer, but there are many more consequences in stock for us locally. We live on the bay. We live on the beautiful bay. Well, the bay is actually we have lots of land that's very close to sea level, and all of those red areas that you see there are projected to be underwater by 2050 if things don't change and change quickly and radically. And another hugely daunting consequence for California has to do with water. So basically, the way California gets water is as we get snow in the Sierras. The snow accumulates over the winter time, and then gradually over the course of the year, that water is released from the snowpack and runs down into reservoirs and rivers and so forth that provide the drinking water and irrigation water and so forth that we need. About 42% of our state's water supply is tied up in this snowpack. And if we look to 2050, forecasts are that every place you see a red in those little images there, those are places essentially where it's anticipated that the snowpack in the Sierra will be gone. So this could have devastating consequences again for our water supply, which is so crucial to our ecosystems, to our farming community, and of course all of us who need water for our lives. So this is a graph. So the culprit in all of this is carbon dioxide. It's the single largest contributor to global warming. Carbon dioxide is emitted when you burn fossil fuels. There are other ways it's emitted as well, but that's the number one source. And you can see that carbon dioxide emissions have continued to increase steadily. They're increasing today. And if we want to solve this problem, if we want to limit warming to 2 degrees C, which we can already see has got a lot of baked-in consequences, what we need to do is we need to do this globally. We need to drop down to zero emissions by about 2070. Okay, so that's globally. That includes, Africa, Asia, places that are still just in the very, very early stages of their economic development and really need the energy that could be provided from fossil fuels. So the thinking is that those developed economies who have the wherewithal and the resources should decarbonize much faster. They should try to get to zero emissions by 2050. And of course, there are some early movers. These can be companies. These are countries who who've decided that they're going to do their part as soon as they possibly can, some even as early as 2030. So I mentioned that the culprit in global warming is really CO2 emissions from and the vast majority of those come from energy, about 76%. So the bottom line is that if we want to solve the global warming problem, we're going to have to radically transform the global energy system. Okay, so that's some pretty heavy stuff, but there is really good news, and I want to focus the rest of my remarks on the good news and the role that Silicon Valley has played and can play in the future. So the first part of the good news is that the core technologies for getting to zero emissions have gotten cheap. Solar panels, wind turbines, lithium-ion batteries, the prices have literally plummeted. And in many cases, these provide the lowest cost options for providing electricity, for example. And lithium ion batteries, now that they've become so inexpensive, it opens the door to electric transportation. Of course, we're surrounded by that in Silicon Valley. But not only can we have electric cars, but we need to be able to start storing energy or electricity from the grid so that when the sun shines in the daytime, we can use it, but we can also put it in a battery or other form of storage, and we can use it at nighttime. And again, the good news is that all of these have become very cost effective. The other good news is that there are growing commitments to net zero emissions. There are companies, including many in Silicon Valley, who've made commitments to deep reductions very quickly. There are nations, there are states, there are cities, there are counties, and this is just a teeny list of a long group of people. So people are ready to act, motivated by their own personal experiences, but also motivated by social good. So the way I see it is we kind of have a puzzle facing us today. And we have all the pieces of the puzzle. We have the technology, we've got the goodwill, we've even got supportive policies, at least in some places. We need more of that. And the question is, how do you put all these pieces together to provide an electricity system, an energy system that has the same reliability, low cost, convenience of use as the system we have today? Because actually the system we have today is pretty amazing if you think about it, how affordable it is to be able to have abundant energy when and where we need it. What we just want to do is we want to be able to eliminate those emissions, and that requires a lot of system integration. Like in the old days, your gasoline car, you just go to a gas station and fill it up. It has no impact on the electricity system. But in the future, as everybody's charging their cars, either at nighttime or in workplace charging, that's going to have a big impact on the grid. These are very big consumers of energy. Similarly, things like heating, and how do we make heavy duty industry work, and how do we get that 24/7 reliability for electricity systems when now we're relying on the sun and the wind. We're relying on the weather for our energy, and so we're going to have to be much more thoughtful and clever how we integrate that. And so from my perspective, at this moment in time, really it's energy systems integration is today's innovation frontier. A decade it was a cheaper battery and cheaper solar panels, and so it's certainly going to be important to continue to reduce cost and scale those technologies. But sort of the stumbling block right now is to figure out how to put all these pieces together. So what we need to do, again, here, a role for Silicon Valley is to use data, massive amounts of data to, think about it like an energy system on autopilot, right? We fly planes on autopilot. Well, we basically need autopilot for the energy system. So we need massive amounts of data on energy demands, weather conditions, pricing, and so forth. And we need models that can optimize how we're using, when and where we use energy and where we're getting it from. And we need to be able to do this under uncertainty, because the reality is there's a lot of moving parts in this. But the goal is to identify what are the lowest cost solutions How is our energy needs going to shift over the course of a day, over the course of months, over the course of years? And what kind of supportive policies do we need to stimulate investment in those technologies that will help us scale and integrate quickly? And also in the course of this analysis, we're going to find that there are certain technologies that we simply don't have. And that helps us pinpoint those kind of new technologies that would be most beneficial. So again, at the heart of Silicon Valley, we need better controls, we need optimization, we need forecasting, we need data analytics. On the right-hand side is a graph showing some new work we've done, where every moment over the course of a year, you can figure out where your electricity is coming from. Because we trade electricity all around the grid. It's quite extraordinary. You can figure out what the real-time emissions are, so you can decide whether or not you want to use electricity in that moment, because maybe it has more emissions than you want. So a very complex scheduling and integration problem. So while we were all paying attention to a lot of other things, Silicon Valley has actually become an epicenter of clean energy innovation. And at Stanford, we did a project with the American Energy Society to basically try to quantify this. And so we did a big survey to try to identify all of the energy companies. And shockingly, we came up with over 1,500 companies in the Silicon Valley area. And you can see by all those dots, in the South Bay, huge cluster of entrepreneurs and inventors and companies working in the space, things like energy storage technologies, energy systems management and integration, solar energy, wind energy, anyway, huge list. So you can go to the website there if you're interested to learn more about these companies. And Stanford, of course, is doing its part. We have over 100 energy-related companies that have been spun out of the university, associated with clean tech. The Tomcat Innovation Transfer Program is quite extraordinary. They have a portfolio of 70 companies that they have incubated over the years, and then since 2013, with a $5 million investment, they've gotten over $403 million of external follow-on funding, 713 employees, and $53 million of annual revenues. And honestly, this is just the very beginning of the coming clean tech revolution. So what can Silicon Valley do? I talked a lot about energy AI for energy systems integration, basically autopilot for the energy system. I think another really important contribution, and it's why we see all these companies, all these energy companies in Silicon Valley, that they want to be in an environment that understands innovation, that understands scaling, that understands what it takes to go from a seed of an idea to creating profitable companies. Third one, on a slightly different vein, is that we can join together to begin to reduce what we call our scope 3 emissions. Now, what are scope 3 emissions? Well, if I buy something, like if I buy a computer from store, well, it took a lot of energy to make that computer, and that energy had a lot of emissions associated with making that computer. So if I buy that computer, there's a certain amount of energy emissions embodied in that. And it turns out that most organizations, most individuals, that other than flying, if you're a big flyer, your scope 3 emissions often are much larger than the rest of your emissions. So, and especially as we get cleaner electricity and cleaner cars, these scope 3 emissions are going to be a bigger and bigger portion of our portfolio. And we really need to work together in partnership to figure out, how do we get the data? How do we begin to start working with suppliers and having them understand that we want those cleaner products? And we can have buying coalitions, for example, that would help really create the marketplace for new low carbon products. Another opportunity is to really use the international reach of many of your companies. You have offices, factories all around the world, working quickly to decarbonize those and lead by example in those countries to help them get on the pathway to reducing emissions, because we need everybody to do this. So I'm just going to end with one quick thought. So Stanford, in addition to doing research, we also have our own emissions reductions targets. We've been very aggressive at reducing our own campus emissions. By next year, we'll be 82% below the historical high. But we have so much to learn to further reduce emissions, and we are putting together a climate pledge accelerator, which is essentially a coalition of committed partners interested in low-cost energy solutions, creating a set of open source tools and models so that others can take advantage of this, to identify supportive policy frameworks, market structures, and finance to help move things along, and to create a whole library of case studies on what's worked and what hasn't, because we certainly don't want to have people not learn from our mistakes, and we certainly want them to learn from our successes so they can move faster and farther. And really create a learning community where we can work together on really the battle of our lifetime to the fight against climate change. So thank you very much.
Great, Professor Benson, thank you so much for bringing climate change home for us. Appreciate it.
Oh, well, thank you. Thanks, Mark.
I feel like we needed one of those NFL crowd sound machines to give the right kind of roar and applause to your insights. We'll have to try that for next year. I wanted to ask a couple of questions because there's so much to unpack there. Russ was talking earlier about COVID, and he said this is a low probability, high impact event. Took us by surprise, and here we are all figuring it out. And here we are with climate that's really a high probability, high impact, and many decades, if not centuries, kind of an emergency. And I wonder if you could help us understand kind of where we are in that. The Paris Accord was signed a little over 5 years ago. That seemed hopeful because people were going to start the mobilization process. But here we are, 2021. What's unique about this moment in this high probability, high impact kind of a crisis?
Yeah. Well, I think that there's sort of a juxtaposition of a couple of things. One is what I already talked about, that people are starting to feel that it's affecting them, and they're mad as hell, and we're not going to take this anymore. So people really want to do something. I think that the second thing is that we have a very constructive government framework now. We have an administration where this is really top priority. It's been a top priority in Europe for a long time. I think I really think governments around the world, those with the capacity to think about these things in the moment, are realizing that we need to get going. So I think that's the second important thing. And then really the third one is that, we have this kit of technology that is ready to go, and places like California and Denmark and the UK, and have now actually a lot of experience, like even like North Dakota, like 68% of their electricity actually comes from wind. They figured out how to do all of this integration. So there are people who have this experience who can help the rest of us learn. So I think it's really those three things which make me actually really optimistic that we can make a lot of rapid progress.
It does feel like a fulcrum between understanding the impact and then the potential solutions. I'm reading Bill Gates's new book on climate, which is a nice primer for the rest of us to really understand the issues in a way that's approachable. And he says, look, there's two numbers you need to understand. One is 51 billion or 37 billion, depending on which greenhouse gas number you're looking at. 51 billion greenhouse gas equivalent CO2 tons per year of extra CO2 going into the atmosphere. And the other number is zero, which is the number we need to get to stop adding to the problem. And I wonder if you could help us with that. In Silicon Valley, trying to bring this home, what are the big pools of carbon emissions that we need to think about and try to, as early movers, because that's who we are, try to reduce the most quickly, soonest?
Right. Well, electricity is really a big one. And I think that there's lots of options to decarbonize electricity using renewables, nuclear, natural gas with carbon capture and storage. We have a whole, and we really need a mashup of those to provide the reliability and cost effectiveness as we want. Another one is transportation. And you can break that into light duty, heavy duty. Light duty, I think there's every reason to believe that electrification of light duty is, on its way. There's a lot of work, a lot of money we need to spend for infrastructure and so forth. There's heavy duty. That's hard, right? We don't have good solutions for heavy duty yet. And I know there's, innovation in hydrogen and battery electric trucks, but it's a different issue. So good trajectory, but some issues. But there are these things we call these hard to abate sectors. It's basically industry like making steel, making aluminum, making cement. Excuse me. These things, you can't just plug it into the a wall socket. They use fossil fuels, and sometimes some of these even use fossil fuels like as a chemical feedstock, not just for heat or electricity. So these hard to abate sectors, we need to come up with plan B. So carbon capture and storage is a technology that that has been in, I would say, sort of a slow phase of development for about 20 years. The idea is that you at the smokestack, you put in a chemical scrubber, you capture that CO2, and then you have to put it somewhere where it never goes back into the atmosphere. That could be underground, it could be construction materials and so forth. But even then, what we're going to find is it's hard to get to exactly zero. So I think most climate scientists have come to the realization we're actually going to have to start pulling carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. Basically, sort of a vacuum cleaner for the atmosphere, and sequester those emissions. And I think that that's a very important class of new technology. But I'm always a little cautious that people let's just jump there. Well, the reality is that we've got the rest of this 51 billion, and maybe we can reduce 80% of that pretty easily with the kit we have. And so let's not sort of hold back on doing the things that we can do because we're waiting for something that in the ultimately we'll need.
And I hear both those categories, the hard to do things that Silicon Valley needs to innovate through and build the companies that are going to go solve the unsolved problems, batteries and offshore wind and carbon capture and cement. But also those big pools that we do have a path on, electricity and transportation, where we can have an impact most quickly. I want to wrap up here with all of our roles. We wear multiple hats. Some of us are scientists and engineers, but all of us work in organizations and we have homes. And there are things that we can do to quickly become part of that early mover solution, reduce carbon emissions dramatically and soon. And so here's a few things on your slide. There'll be a link to jointventure.org and the climate page. But one thing we can all do both at work and at the dinner table tonight is have a conversation about what is our carbon footprint? Where do we put out the most emissions? And what could we do to reduce that quickly and soon in an affordable way with resources available? And then to talk about that, have those conversations with others, share the struggle or the discovery process that we're all having. Second, take a look at the joint venture page for something called Climate Safe California, which is a science-driven, urgency-driven set of goals and policies to accelerate our move to zero and net negative emissions, even by 2030, which is really what the science says that early movers need to do. And then look at another initiative that we're working on called Beyond Gasoline. We use about 1 billion gallons, billion with a B, 1 billion gallons of gasoline in Silicon Valley. And one of the things that we can do is collectively is be outcome oriented and drop that down by helping people to use alternatives to gas driven cars. So electric vehicles, e-bikes, public transportation, et cetera. Professor Benson, thank you so much for being our guide and for your insights. And we'll look forward to updating this same set of kind of emergency and action orientation next year. Thank you so much.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Mark.